Welcome to BizTech's APAC Cybersecurity Show. I'm Brian Fernandez, and today, alongside my co-host Benjamin Ang, Head of Center of Excellence for National Security at RSIS NTU, we focus on cybersecurity in the banking sector. And to bring an expert lens, we've got as our guest Philip Ivancic, and he's the Head of Solutions Strategy at Synopsys Software Integrity Group. Synopsys is the world's leading provider of solutions for designing and verifying advanced silicon chips, as well as for creating next-generation processors and models necessary for chip manufacturing. On that note, Philip, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you very much, Brian and Ben.
Philip, great to chat with you. And from the chat that we were having before the show started, we're really getting into software supply chain risks. Maybe for the benefit of BizTech Asia listeners, could you give some examples of what's software supply chain risk? Because it might be new to a lot of people.
Yeah, I think first we just have to talk about the absolute importance of software security to the banking and fintech customer base across Asia Pacific. The reality is, by the nature of the data they hold, they are going to be attacks, and people are going to try everything they can to exploit any kind of vulnerability. So that's just the nature of being a bank. Now, everyone in the sector understands that. What is specific about software supply chain is that means you've also got to understand the components that make up your own software. You have to understand the components that make up the software of third parties who you are relying on. And a final element is you also need to understand how you are exchanging data through APIs with third parties, because many banks and fintechs will potentially have a promotion on their website with Shopee or Amazon.com or something like that, and they're exchanging data. So all of that makes up software supply chain. And it matters because every single major mass exfiltration of customer data has come down to exploiting a software vulnerability. So anytime you've read the headlines, 10 million records lost, $50 million records lost, it's always been a software vulnerability. So it's always been a risk for the banks. What has become much more complex, of course, is now you've not only got to understand your own software, but all of the complex interactions between what your own applications are doing in this modern digital world and what your suppliers are giving you and what you're interacting with third parties.
And Philip, I'm just thinking about this when you were explaining it, and I'm thinking of the complexity of banking payments, infrastructure, and transactions, and all the hooks that have been going into new fintechs over the last 3 years, because payments used to be a much simpler thing 5 years ago.
Yeah.
Pre-COVID, much simpler, but with innovations of fintechs, with open APIs, we've obviously have a lot more connectors. And therefore, and this starts to set me thinking again of all the vulnerabilities across the supply chain, which most of us don't really think about.
Yep, you're absolutely right. And what's interesting here in Southeast Asia is Southeast Asia is really a huge hub for fintechs, partially because of just the need to serve huge populations that have mobile phones but may not have had access to traditional banking or normal web application banking. This has given a rise to a lot of fintechs. But also, in this modern world, there is also this need to share and promote, and people expect that if they have a particular favorite payments app or something, that payments app is going to maybe reward them with shopping experiences or points or any number of things that people expect as part of their user experience. And all of that is achieved through APIs. So as a fintech, as a bank, you've actually got to really understand all of the data flows between yourself and third parties and make sure that is in fact secure, and you've got to keep a constant inventory of it. And there's specific regulators right across the region. Last week I was in Manila, and the BSP, the bank regulator in the Philippines, was specifically talking about API security for that reason, because it's an emerging area of threat and risk. And with some banks or major fintechs, you have systemic risk where you could get mass exfiltration of customer data, but you could also end up inadvertently, affecting others and vice versa. So it is a big area that a lot of people are talking to us about.
Okay, then can you give us some examples then of some of these attacks and how they've happened?
Okay, well, I'll start with that first area of attack, which was the components of the software that you build. So when software developers build software, they don't necessarily build every single line of code from scratch. What they do is they borrow components, and usually these components are open source, i.e. a community of developers have developed them, and they create a project, and that project creates useful functionality. There is absolutely nothing wrong with that. But you need to know exactly what open source components are in your software, because there's actually some things that as a bank or as a fintech or an insurance company are particularly important for you to know to analyze your risk. First, you want to understand, does that component have any known vulnerabilities, right? That's just the basics. Is there something exploitable in there? Secondly, even if it doesn't, you want to know that there's an actual active community still working on it, right? So if a component has not had anyone touch a line of code since 2016, that's a real operational risk. There might not be any known published vulnerability, but there could still be a problem where if something turned up today, there's just no one to fix it. It's a dead project. And then the final area is licensing. And this comes up particularly with people who are building products. Open source is, yes, by its nature, free, but it's still licensed. Some licenses only allow you to use that component if you agree to then make everything that you're working on open source, which is obviously not acceptable to commercial organizations. And there has been examples of projects suing very large corporations because effectively they'd breached the terms of using that component. So you need to know where they are. Then in terms of a specific breach, one of the most widely publicized that some of the listeners today might have heard of was called Log4j. So Log4j was a ubiquitous component used in pretty much every Java project for the last 15, 20 years, right? And a vulnerability was discovered where a malicious person could execute code directly into your software, into your application, and they could do it remotely. A hugely critical vulnerability was discovered. And the problem, if you don't have an automatic way of knowing which of your projects, which of your software, which of your applications had this particular vulnerability, you'd be scrambling to work out how you're going to fix it. So we've got ways of helping people do that automatically, and it's a big part of our business. And the software we use is called Software Composition Analysis, SCA, and it's that tooling that allows organizations to automatically figure out whether or not an open source component has a vulnerable Log4j subcomponent in it and exactly where it is in their software, and then to do something about it. By the way, even though this was published a couple of years ago, it's still a problem as of about 2 months ago when we last did our research. About 40% of software downloaded from the internet or from app stores still had vulnerable Log4j in it, right? So it's been a well-known thing, but it's nearly impossible to detect without this level of automation.
This is really interesting, right? So there's probably two questions that the average business owner might ask if they're not familiar with software development, which is why can't you just not use open source components like Log4j, and which, yeah, definitely could reason. And then secondly, why not just try and manually catalog the components in the software? So
okay. Not using open source is nearly impossible for the main reason that it's in about 80% of all software written, including banking software, including military, including whatnot. So the simple fact is you're just not going to handwrite every single thing that you need. And particularly if you're doing a digital transformation project, you are going to take what is already existing and build your own business logic on top of that.
How about getting, with all these no-code or low-code platforms, is that a way to get around this problem?
No, because they're still ultimately leveraging some sort of baseline of functionality that almost certainly came from that. All they're doing is they're helping you write your business logic a little bit quicker. But yeah, they're still, the end result is still going to be something that has probably leveraged something that has come before.
Okay.
Which might be even more dangerous.
And just to finish off then, why not do it manually? Well, with our SCA tool Black Duck, we are tracking 200 million open source projects, their exact timelines, all of their history. It's impossible to do it manually, right? And of course, things are constantly changing. So yeah, it's just hugely complex, and that's why no one tries to do it manually. What tends to happen is people don't understand the risk, so they don't do it at all, in which case they're leaving themselves vulnerable, or they end up turning to companies like Synopsys who help them automate all of this.
Okay.
Philip, thanks for giving us the scale, 200 million.
That's crazy. Now, so if I'm a bank chief security officer, CIO, I obviously need to track all these. I need to find out what are the components of all this. I need to ensure I need to be in compliance with the various regulations, the regulatory framework that I'm under. And this is a huge, and I'm just thinking about it, it's a massive undertaking. So how do I do this?
Well, I think, Yeah, certainly I've spent a lot of time with bank CIOs and CISOs in my career, or even just the last few weeks as I've been traveling around Southeast Asia. Automation is the key. So it starts with having a policy. So the policy will typically be you can use open source components, but the bank will typically vet and say, look, you have to use these. Now, we all know in the real world, people will still not necessarily read your policy, or there may still be projects that do it. So then you need to automatically detect whether or not a software component is vulnerable, has operational risk, or has licensing risk. And like I said, we have tooling that automatically does that. Then that's one part. The second part is if you are not getting information from your third parties, you need to be able to analyze what they're giving you. And we've got software that automatically figures that out for you and adds that to your list of ingredients so that you know what's in your environment. And the final element is the APIs. We've got software that automatically tells you exactly the data flows of all of your third-party APIs and automatically keeps that up to date. Because like I said, in the real world, one week you're going to have a Shopee API with a promotion. Another week you'll have a Singapore Airlines API with points. Another week you might have a promotion with American Express, and that will be a completely different API, right? And that's why you just need automation and being able to get all of that automatically. And then you need to be able to ensure that the right information is getting back to your engineers and your software developers so that they can do something with it, right? So you don't want them overwhelmed with, like I said, 200 million data points. If I got a ticket with 200 million things in it and I'm a software developer, I'd just go, right, next, I'm not going to look at that. So you then need to give highly targeted information that says, hi, please fix this on line 135. If you do that and click yes in this particular ticket, it will automatically rescan, check that it's done, and you won't need to worry about it anymore as a developer.
Philip, from what you've described, and you've got a lot of experience in banking, it sounds that it would also apply to lots of other industries as well that are connected, where enterprises are connected to other enterprises.
Absolutely, absolutely. With banking, because of how we just started our conversation, by its very nature is more mature than other enterprises, right? They've been, in this arms race with hackers for 30, 40 years. So they kind of understand it. But certainly across the board now, application security is coming to its fore. For a long time, other organizations thought about their network, they thought about their firewalls, they thought about those types of things, but they've now come to the same conclusion as I started. Every single mass exfiltration of data has come down to a software vulnerability. And, once they understand that there are automated ways of looking after this, they're perfectly fine, right? But it just seems like an overwhelming problem if you aren't aware of it and you aren't aware that automation and solutions are available and are already in use by major banks here in Asia Pacific.
And Ben, speaking of automation and learning and reducing complexity, obviously we can't run away from the fact that machine learning and AI are here to stay and is going to really, or is revolutionizing the way we deal with these problems.
Yep, I can't agree more. Every bank CISO I've spoken to in the last couple of months wanted to do some threat modeling or risk assessment on AI. because even if you've banned ChatGPT or whatnot from your network, you have no way of being able to stop a developer going home and using it at home, right? And then potentially borrowing some of that for their particular project at work, right? Now, it's a blessing and a curse. It does make things absolutely faster. And, our engineering teams will be using it. And certainly as we start making through the threat and risk assessments with the various banks, I'm sure many of them will turn to it for some of their development. It is a curse because a couple of months ago at Black Hat, our engineers showed at the Black Hat conference how you can train ChatGPT to commit code that has SQL injection, one of the most serious types of vulnerabilities, right? So we just demonstrated live, this is how you can train AI to do naughty things as well, right? And it's also particularly tricky because now AI by its nature has been trained on open source, but it's not necessarily taking the full component and all of the information about open source. It might be taking what is known as a snippet. And so now you might only have a small part of a vulnerable open source project generated by AI code. So now you need to be able to understand what open source snippets are in your environment, much more than perhaps you did 6 or 12 months ago when most people would use the entire component. But of course, large language models by their nature are just using whatever they find on the internet. Luckily, again, Synopsys has been in this game for long enough, so we've got ways of automatically figuring out what snippets are used. Therefore, we can figure out exactly what open source component, what version, and if there's any vulnerabilities for that as well. But yeah, it will definitely, it will change everything, but it will change nothing from a security perspective. You're still going to have to do risk assessments. You're still going to have to scan your software for vulnerabilities. You're still going to have to do penetration tests, just like a human had written every single line of code. What it will do is you're just probably going to have to do it a lot faster, and automation is just going to come in on its own.
That's pretty chilling. So when you consider that, right? So we're going to summarize basically penetration testing, risk assessment, and I missed out one.
Yeah, source code scanning, software
scanning.
Composition analysis, having an understanding of what your software is doing, what third-party software that you're relying on, what is it made up of, and is there any exposure that you need to be aware of, and what are your APIs and how are you exchanging data with those APIs? You get on top of those, you've definitely covered the major components that everyone is worried about, not only in banking, but as you correctly said, Ben, across the board. And yeah, as a vendor, Synopsys is in a unique position. We can help you automate all elements of that.
Philip,
so
on
if
that
regulators,
note, sorry, go ahead. Ben, you
go
wanted
ahead.
to say something? Go ahead.
So I just guess that if more regulators around the world started adopting the software bill of materials, like making it more requirements for vendors to provide a bill of materials for the software components, this would help. This kind of technology would help.
Absolutely. It's got a lot of publicity since the US federal government about a year ago insisted that every supplier of software to the US federal government creates a bill of materials, essentially a menu of the components that make up their software. And it took a big, powerful buyer like the US federal government to do that. Now, across APAC, I'm seeing it is matter of course for banks in Singapore, in Australia, in Hong Kong to ask their suppliers for a software bill of materials because they've also got huge market power. They're big customers, but as we discussed, they're on top of the game. They also know that they have to be on top of their software supply chain, and that means you've got to know what your various suppliers are giving you and what is making that up, so that if there is another log4j, not only can you find it in the software you've developed yourself, but you can very quickly go, oh, right, this third party has it. We got to do something and make sure we put extra controls around that application.
Philip, this has been a great conversation. I think I've really learned a lot from both your comments and those from Ben as well. But before we leave, any final key takeaways you want to leave the audience with?
No, I think we've covered it all. You can automate much of the scanning parts. Certainly, Synopsys can help you with that. But for the most part, you really just got to think about not only the software you're developing yourself, but the total supply chain that you as a business are relying on.
On that note, Philip, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Now, we've been speaking to Philip Ivancic. He's the Head Solution Strategy at Synopsys Software Integrity Group. I'm Brian Fernandez, together with my co-host Benjamin Ang, and you've been listening and watching to BizTech's APAC Cybersecurity Show. This interview will be on our website, www.biztech.asia, as well as our syndication partners, TV stations, radio stations, and websites. Thanks a lot for tuning in.